The train always slowed at the signal near the old brick Victorian, a mechanical hitch that gave me exactly 45 seconds to play God. I would press my forehead against the cool, grime-streaked glass of the 804 from Ashbury and peer into the lives of the people at number 15. I called them Leo and Mia. In my head, they were the golden couple, the antithesis of the wreck I had become. He was a designer. She was a poet. They drank wine on the terrace and laughed in a way that suggested they didn't have a single dark corner in their hearts. They were my anchors. As the train lurched forward, leaving them behind, I take a swig from my water bottle, warm gin that tasted like gasoline and regret, and try to remember when my own life hadn't been a series of blurred windows. My name is Clara, and I am a professional observer of things that don't belong to me. 2 years ago, I lived 5 houses down from them with Tom. Now, I live in a cramped spare room belonging to a friend who is too polite to tell me I smell like a distillery. I lost my job, I lost my husband, and I lost my grip on the sequence of events that led me here. All I have left is the train and the couple at number 15. Everything changed on a Tuesday. The train slowed, the signal hummed, and I looked for Mia. But she wasn't on the terrace with a book. She was in the garden, and she wasn't alone. A man, not Leo, was pressing her against the fence, his hands tangled in her hair. It was a betrayal so visceral it felt like a physical blow to my chest. My perfect couple was a lie. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of gin and fury. How could she? She had everything I had lost, and she was throwing it away on a stranger in the afternoon sun. That night, the blackout came. It's a familiar velvet curtain that drops over my mind when I drink too much, leaving behind only jagged fragments of memory. The smell of damp earth, the screech of brakes, and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. When I woke up the next morning, my blue dress was torn and my scalp was throbbing. And Mia was on the news. She was missing. The police didn't want to listen to a woman who couldn't remember her own middle name. Detective Sykes looked at me with the weary patience of someone dealing with a stray dog. I told him about the man in the garden, the other man who had violated the sanctity of number 15. Sykes just made a note of my history, the harassment calls to my ex-husband, the accidental appearances at my old neighborhood, the drinking. In their eyes, I wasn't a witness. I was a nuisance. But I knew what I saw. I started hanging around the station, watching Leo. His real name was Scott. I learned, as he pleaded with the cameras for his wife's return. He looked broken, a mirror image of the grief I carried every day. I approached him under the guise of being a friend of Mia's. I wanted to help him, or perhaps I just wanted to be back inside a life that felt significant. As we sat in his kitchen, the air thick with the scent of unwashed dishes and desperation, I realized that Scott wasn't the man I had imagined from the train. He was volatile, prone to sudden bursts of temper that left the room vibrating. He showed me Mia's phone, which she'd left behind. It was full of messages from a man named Dr. Kamal, her therapist. The man from the garden. The fragments of my blackout started to sharpen into needles. I remembered being in the underpass near the tracks. I remembered seeing a woman, was it Mia? And calling out to her. I remembered a flash of silver, like a watch or a ring, and then nothing but the roar of the train. I went to see Dr. Kamal, pretending to be a patient. I wanted to catch him in a lie, to see the guilt written on his face. But as we talked, the perspective shifted. He wasn't a predator. He was a man trying to help a woman who was terrified of her own home. He told me Mia was restless, trapped in a marriage that felt like a cage. He denied being in the garden that Tuesday. I left his office feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. If it wasn't Kamal, then who was the man by the fence? And why did the memory of that night keep leading me back to my own ex-husband's house? Tom lived at number 23 with his new wife, Anna, and their perfect baby. Anna hated me with a quiet, simmering intensity. She saw me as the crazy ex who wouldn't let go, the woman who lurked in the shadows of their suburban dream. But as I sat on the train, watching the houses blur past, a new thought began to take root. A thought so cold it made the gin in my stomach turn to ice. Tom had told everyone I was the violent one, that I had tried to hurt the baby, that my blackouts were filled with rage. But what if the blackouts weren't the cause of my memory loss? What if they were the result of someone else's handiwork? I started looking at the photos Tom had sent me during our marriage, the ones of me passed out, looking like a monster. I noticed the dates. I noticed the inconsistencies. I realized that for years, I had been told who I was by a man who needed me to be broken so he could look like a hero. The second batch will delve into the final confrontation and the shattering of the ultimate illusion. I went back to the underpass. It was a place of shadows and the rhythmic thumping of the world passing by above. I stood where I thought I had stood that night, the air smelling of rust and old rain. The memory hit me then, not as a fragment, but as a tidal wave. I hadn't seen Mia being taken by a stranger. I had seen her getting into a car, Tom's car. I remembered running toward them, my voice slurred, trying to save her or perhaps just trying to be seen. I remembered Tom's face, not the face of the man who loved me, but the face of a man who was tired of hiding his true self. He hadn't been helping me all those years. He had been gaslighting me, convincing me of my own insanity so I wouldn't question his affairs, his lies, his cruelty. Mia wasn't a poet from a train window. She was a woman who had fallen into the same trap I had, and she had been silenced because she was about to escape. I didn't go to the police this time. I went to Anna. I found her in the garden of number 23, the sun hitting the stroller in a way that looked agonizingly peaceful. I told her everything. Not the gin-soaked version, but the cold, hard truth. I told her about the man in the garden, the car in the underpass, and the way Tom looked when he thought no one was watching. Anna didn't scream. She didn't call me crazy. She just looked at the baby, and then she looked at the woods behind the house. She knew, deep down, in the places she didn't admit to herself during the 2 a.m. feedings. She knew the man she had married was a hollowed-out shell. We sat there, two wives of the same man, waiting for the monster to come home for dinner. When Tom arrived, the air in the kitchen turned brittle. He played his part perfectly at first, the concerned husband, the weary father. But as I laid out the pieces of the puzzle, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. He saw the look in Anna's eyes and realized the game was over. He turned on me, his voice a low, guttural hiss, telling me that no one would believe a drunk, that I was a nothing, a ghost on a train. He moved toward me, his hands reaching for the neck that had once worn his jewelry. But Anna wasn't a spectator anymore. She saw the future I had lived, and she chose a different ending. The struggle was brief and violent, a collision of years of suppressed rage and the desperate need for survival. When it was over, Tom was on the floor, and the silence that followed was the first real peace I had felt in years. The police arrived, and this time, Sykes didn't look at me like a nuisance. He looked at the evidence, the physical reality of a man who had built a life on the broken bones of the women who loved him. They found Mia in the woods behind the house, buried under the same earth I had smelled on my clothes that night. She wasn't a character in my head anymore. She was a girl who had finally been found. I still take the 804 from Ashbury, but I don't look at number 15 anymore. I don't need to play God with other people's lives to feel like my own has meaning. I don't drink gin from water bottles, and the windows aren't blurred by the fog of a blackout. I look at the trees, the way the light hits the tracks, and the faces of the people sitting across from me. They are just people, full of their own small joys and private sorrows, and that is enough. I am Clara, and I am no longer a professional observer. I am the woman who stayed on the train until she reached her own stop. The world is still moving, the signals are still humming, but for the first time, I know exactly where I am going. I am going home, and this time the door is locked from the inside, and I am the only one with the key. The transition from the chaos of the kitchen to the sterility of the police station felt like waking up from a dream into a cold shower. Detective Sykes didn't ask me about my drinking habits this time. He didn't look over my shoulder at the clock, waiting for his shift to end so he could escape the crazy woman. He sat across from me with a transcript and a recording device, his expression a mixture of professional focus and something that looked a lot like an apology. I told the story again, but this time it didn't feel like I was grasping at smoke. The words were solid. The memory of Tom's hands, the memory of Mia's terrified eyes in the rearview mirror, and the way Anna had stood her ground. It was all there, filed away in the cabinet of the new Clara. Anna didn't testify against me for being in her house that day. In fact, she didn't say much to anyone at first. She was busy scrubbing the metaphorical blood off her life, packing away Tom's clothes into black garbage bags that sat on the curb like bloated monuments to a failed empire. We didn't become friends. We weren't the kind of women who could share a coffee and laugh about the past. We were survivors of the same shipwreck, and sometimes the only thing you want to do with a fellow survivor is walk in the opposite direction so you don't have to look at the scars. But I saw her one last time before I moved out of my friend's spare room. She was at the park with the baby, sitting on a bench, looking at the horizon. She saw me and gave a single, sharp nod. It was a silent pact. The monster was gone, and we were the ones who had pulled the trigger on the lie. The media coverage was a circus for a while. The drunk on the train who saw too much was a favorite headline. They wanted me to be a tragic hero, a woman redeemed by her own brokenness. I turned down the interviews. I didn't want to be a story anymore. I wanted to be a person. I moved to a small flat near the coast, far away from the Ashbury line and the Victorian houses that held too many echoes. I got a job at a local library, a place where the only stories were bound in leather and didn't scream back at you in the middle of the night. The craving for gin still claws at the back of my throat sometimes, especially when the rain hits the windows a certain way, but I've learned to sit with the feeling until it passes. I don't need the fog anymore. The clarity is painful, but it's mine. One afternoon, I found myself standing at a train station again, not for a commute, but for a trip to see my mother. I stood on the platform, the familiar scent of ozone and hot metal filling the air, and for a second, my heart hammered against my ribs. I thought about the 804. I thought about Leo and Mia, the fictional versions I had created to keep myself company. I realized then that I had spent so much time looking into other people's windows because I couldn't bear to look into my own. I was a ghost because I had let Tom haunt me while I was still alive. As the train pulled in, I didn't look for a seat by the window. I sat in the middle of the carriage, surrounded by the murmur of real lives, and I pulled a book from my bag. It wasn't a thriller. It was a guide to the local flora of the coast. As the train began to move, the world outside started to blur. I didn't try to catch the details of the back gardens or the expressions of the people standing on their porches. I looked at my own reflection in the glass. For the first time in years, the woman looking back wasn't a stranger. She was tired. She had lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and she looked like someone who had been through a war. But her eyes were clear. She wasn't watching a movie. She was living a life. The train picked up speed, the rhythm of the tracks becoming a steady, heartbeat-like thump. I wasn't the girl on the train anymore. I was just a passenger, and for the first time I was perfectly fine with not knowing exactly what was happening in the houses we passed. I had my own house now, and the windows were clean.